Chapter 4. The Wedding Feast in Cana. In early spring, Cana was filled with the fragrance of almond flowers. In the wedding tent, the bridegroom was rubbing his hands anxiously, and the steward whispered in his ear, "The third jar of wine is empty." The bride was hiding behind the curtain, wiping her tears, and her skirt embroidered with pomegranate flowers was covered in dust. Jesus and his mother Mary sat in the corner, and the 12 disciples gathered around the wooden table. Mary saw the bridegroom's dilemma and quietly took her son's hand. "They have no wine." Jesus looked at the white hair at his mother's temples and remembered the tears in her eyes when she found him after he got lost in the temple at the age of 12. "Woman, my hour has not yet come." But when he saw the helpless sigh of the bride's father and the disappointed expressions of the children holding empty cups, a pang of pain suddenly welled up in his heart. "Fill the jars with water." Jesus pointed to the 6 stone jars under the corridor, and the patterns of the 10 Commandments chiseled by the stonemason were faintly visible in the moonlight. The servants looked at each other. It was not until Mary nodded gently that they carried the buckets and poured water into the jars. When the first scoop of water was ladled out, the clear fragrance of wine suddenly spread in the air. The steward took a sip and his eyes widened. "You have saved the good wine until now." The bridegroom excitedly took Jesus' hand, and the ruby on his ring rubbed against his wrist. "You must be the wine steward in heaven." Jesus smiled and shook his head, his fingertips caressing the words of the commandments on the stone jar. The best wine should be dedicated to those who know how to cherish it. Peter secretly drank 3 large cups during the chaos and was now leaning against a date palm tree, hiccuping. Andrew was busy patting Philip on the back as he was drunk. James and John were arguing about the vintage of the wine, and only Matthew the tax collector was carefully recording every detail, with the ink on the parchment still not dry. When the wedding feast ended, Jesus saw a little girl hiding behind the stone jar, holding a piece of honey cake that was left over. He squatted down and drew a small fish with his fingertips on her palm. The crumbs of the cake suddenly turned into sparkling golden powder, and blue hyacinths bloomed on the ground. "Tomorrow morning," Jesus said softly, "you will find a more beautiful gift by the sea." The girl giggled and ran away, and the bells on her headscarf jingled, startling the pigeons perched on the tent. Chapter 5. The Trembling of the Leprous Man. In the shadow of Mount Nebo, a man with festering sores curled up under the rock, and his tattered cloak couldn't hide the oozing wounds. He heard the footsteps on the mountain path, struggled to get up, and knocked on the bronze bell with a wooden stick. This was the warning method for lepers as prescribed by the law. "Lord," he knelt at Jesus' feet, his forehead touching the hem with patches. "If you are willing, you can make me clean." The disciples stepped back one after another, and Peter accidentally stepped on a thorn and gasped. Jesus looked into the patient's cloudy eyes and saw his own reflection in them, with a faint halo of light rotating above the reflection's head. He stretched out his hand, and just as his fingertips were about to touch the man's festering cheek, James suddenly shouted, "Teacher, the law doesn't allow it." "I am willing. Be clean." Jesus' palm pressed against the patient's forehead, and there was a soft sound like ice melting under the skin. The man shuddered, and the festering wounds healed at a visible speed, and the new skin turned a healthy pink. He tore off his tattered cloak, revealing a head of black curly hair, knelt on the ground, and kissed Jesus' feet, with tears dripping on the calloused feet. "Don't tell anyone Jesus helped him up. Just go to the priest and offer the gift as commanded by Moses as evidence for them to see." But the man's cheering as he ran down the mountain alarmed the entire village. People saw his intact face and knelt down one after another. The nephew of the Pharisee Caiaphas happened to pass by, stared at the man's smooth skin, and the tassels on his cuff trembled with anger. "This is an act of presumption. Who can cleanse a leper except God?" That night, when Jesus was praying under the olive tree, Peter saw a faint light on the back of his teacher's right hand, and a faint red mark appeared where he had touched the patient during the day, like the mark left by a burn. "He bears our diseases," Andrew said softly. Just as it is written in the book of Isaiah, the 12 disciples sat around the campfire, listening to the barking of the dogs in the distance. No one noticed that Jesus' shadow on the ground was stretched long, and a crown of thorns was faintly visible on the head of the shadow. Chapter 6. The Miracle of the 5 Loaves and 2 Fishes. On the hillside by the lake of Gennesaret, 5,000 people gathered on the grass, listening to Jesus preach about the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven. As the sun was setting, Philip counted the money in his purse with a worried face. Even the bread worth 20 taels of silver is not enough to give each person a little. Andrew suddenly saw a boy wander at the edge of the crowd holding a basket in his arms. He said, "There are 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish." Jesus took the basket, and the fragrance of the bread mixed with the saltiness of the fish entered his nostrils. He looked at the sparkling lake in the distance and remembered the wheat cakes his mother had made in his childhood, and the half piece of cake that Joseph had stuffed into his hand before he died. "Bring them to me." He held the bread and fish up to the sky, and the sunlight passed through his fingers, casting a cross-shaped shadow on the bread. When he broke the first piece of bread, tender green wheat seedlings grew where the crumbs fell, swaying gently in the evening wind. "Take some and give it to the people." The 12 disciples held more and more bread and fish, and they were surprised to find that the basket was never empty. Peter almost tripped over his straw sandals. He saw a blind beggar wolfing down the food, and the white film in the corner of his eye had faded halfway. The little girl strung the remaining fish bones into necklaces, and the boys fed the crumbs of the bread to the wild birds by the lake. The birds carried the crumbs and flew towards the setting sun, their wings seemingly gilded. The crowd who had eaten their fill began to tidy up the remaining food, and the 12 baskets were filled to the brim. Jesus stood by the lake, watching the last ray of sunlight disappear on the horizon, and the reflection on the water gradually blurred, turning into the figure of someone nailed to the cross. He shook his head and turned to see the boy who had offered the bread counting the tassels on the basket, his golden hair blowing in the evening wind. "Child, what's your name?" "Emmanuel." The boy looked up and smiled, with the rising moon reflected in his eyes. "Mom said it means God is with us." Jesus suddenly remembered the manger in Bethlehem and the starry night 30 years ago when the baby's cry had shaken the entire universe. He squatted down and gently stroked the boy's head. Yes, he is always with us, in every piece of bread, in every fish, and in every heart that is willing to share. Chapter 7. The Dew in the Garden of Gethsemane. On the eve of the Passover, the temple in Jerusalem was brightly lit. Jesus and the 12 disciples sat around upstairs, and the flames on the bronze lampstand flickered, making the painting of the Passover lamb on the wall go dim and bright. When he took the bread and gave thanks, Peter suddenly noticed that his teacher's fingers were trembling, and the crumbs of the bread fell on the tablecloth, forming a pattern of thorns. "I tell you the truth, one of you will betray me." Jesus' voice was like wine soaked with wormwood. The money bag in Judas's hand fell to the ground with a thud, and 30 silver coins rolled to the feet of the people. John leaned against Jesus' chest and heard his heart beating like a drum, even more rapidly than when he was baptized in the Jordan River. "Teacher, who is it?" he asked softly, feeling Jesus' tears drip onto the top of his head. In the Garden of Gethsemane, on the Mount of Olives, the dew wet Jesus' clothes. He knelt in front of a protruding rock, his hands digging into the soil, and grass roots and stones were embedded in his fingernails. "Father," his voice was carried away by the night wind. "If it is possible, let this cup pass from me, yet not my will but yours be done." The leaves of the olive trees overhead rustled, as if countless voices were whispering. Peter, James, and John lay in the bushes not far away, a mixture of drowsiness and fear, and their eyelids were as heavy as if filled with lead. When Judas led the temple guards into the garden, the moonlight shone on Jesus' back, and his shadow was stretched long in the shape of a cross. "Rabbi!" Judas stepped forward and kissed his cheek, and the smell of myrrh on his beard mixed with the smell of blood entered Jesus' nostrils. The iron boots of the soldiers crushed the dewdrops, and the sound of the swords being drawn startled the night owls perched there. Peter suddenly woke up from his drunkenness, pulled out his dagger, and slashed at the servant of the high priest, cutting off Malchus's right ear. "Put your sword back into its sheath." Jesus bent down and picked up the bloody ear. His fingertips touched the cold earlobe, and the blood at the wound suddenly stopped flowing, and there was a soft click sound from the broken cartilage. Malchus touched his ear, which was now intact, and saw the blood on Jesus' cuff gradually disappearing as if he had never been injured. The soldiers looked at each other, and their hands holding the swords began to tremble. They saw no anger in Jesus' eyes, only deep compassion, like a shepherd looking at a lost lamb. Chapter 8. The Sky over Golgotha. In Pilate's praetorium, the morning sunlight passed through the carved window panes, casting mottled shadows on the ground. The chief priests of the Jews were wearing robes embroidered with gold thread and kept swaying the tassels. "He claims to be the Son of God. This is an act of presumption." Pilate looked at Jesus in front of him. There was a whip mark on the other's face, and the blood had coagulated, but there was not a trace of resentment on his face. "Are you the king of the Jews?" he asked, and the bronze pen in his hand drew crooked lines on the parchment. "My kingdom is not of this world." Jesus' voice was like a worn-out string. "You say I am a king. I was born for this and have come into the world to testify to the truth." Pilate suddenly felt dizzy. He saw blurred figures swaying behind Jesus. Was it Caesar or Augustus? Or Herod the Great, who had long been dead? He shook his head, grabbed the pen dipped in cinnabar, and wrote on the charge board, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews." On the top of Golgotha, 3 crosses stood under the dark clouds. Jesus' hands were nailed to the wood, and the blood flowed from his wrists to his elbows and dripped on the wound on his instep. He looked at the crowd at the foot of the mountain and saw his mother Mary being supported by John. The tear stains on her face were more than when Joseph was buried. "Woman, behold your son. John, behold your mother." His voice was torn apart by the mountain wind. John knelt down and kissed Mary's hand and found a red spot on her palm, the same as the one on Jesus' soul. At noon, the sky suddenly turned as dark as night. Jesus felt as if his chest was filled with lead, and every breath tugged at his ribs. "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani," he shouted, his voice trembling like never before. My God, why have you forsaken me?" A loud noise came from the temple in the distance, and the curtain of the Holy of Holies tore in two from top to bottom, revealing the empty Ark of the Covenant. The words of the commandments on the 2 tablets in the Ark were gradually disappearing. When the soldier stabbed him in the side with a spear, blood and water gushed out immediately and dripped on the rocks of Golgotha. The rocks seemed to be alive, absorbing the blood, and the patterns of grapevines appeared on the surface. Jesus closed his eyes and saw countless specks of light surging towards him. They were the starlight of Bethlehem, the divine light of the Jordan River, the fragrance of the wine in Cana, and the ears of wheat of the 5 loaves and 2 fishes.